The Prussian uprisings were two major and three smaller uprisings by the Prussians, one of the Baltic tribes, against the Teutonic Knights that took place in the 13th century during the Prussian Crusade. The crusading military order, supported by the popes and Christian Europe, sought to conquer and convert the pagan Prussians. In the first 10 years of the Crusade, 5 of the 7 major Prussian clans fell under the control of the less numerous Teutonic Knights. However, the Prussians rose against their conquerors on 5 occasions. The first uprising was supported by Duke Świętoполk II, Duke of Pomerania. The Prussians were successful at first, reducing the Knights to only 5 of their strongest castles. Conversely, the Duke suffered a series of military defeats and was eventually forced to make peace with the Teutonic Knights. With Duke Świętoполk's support for the Prussians broken, a prelate of Pope Innocent IV then negotiated a peace treaty between the Prussians and the Knights. However, this treaty was never honored or enforced, especially after the Battle of Kruchen at the end of 1249. The second uprising, known in historiography as the Great Prussian Uprising, was prompted by the 1260 Battle of Berg, the largest defeat suffered by the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century. This uprising was the longest, largest, and most threatening to the Teutonic Order, who again were reduced to 5 of their strongest castles. Reinforcements for the Knights were slow to arrive, despite repeated encouragements from Pope Urban IV, and the position of the Order looked set to worsen. Luckily for the Order, the Prussians lacked unity and a common strategy, and reinforcements finally reached Prussia in around 1265. One by one, Prussian clans surrendered and the uprising was ended in 1274. The later 3 lesser uprisings depended on foreign help and were suppressed within 1 or 2 years. The last uprising in 1295 effectively ended the Prussian Crusade, and Prussia became a Christian German-speaking territory, which assimilated native Prussians and a number of settlers from different German states. Background: although the Prussians repelled early incursions by the Order of Dobrin, they were outnumbered by attacks from Poland, Russians in the southeast, and the Teutonic Knights from the west. The Teutonic Order was called to the Coma land in 1226 by Conrad I of Masovia, who started a number of attacks and crusades against the Prussians and later asked the Knights to protect him from retaliatory raids by the Prussians. Preoccupied with crusades in the Holy Land, the Teutonic Knights arrived only in 1230. Their first task was to build a base on the left bank of Vistula at Vogelsang, opposite of Turin, which was completed a year later. Led by Hermann Bork, the Knights did not repeat the mistakes of the previous order and did not push eastwards into the forest of the interior. They would further build fortified log castles along major rivers and the Vistula lagoon to serve as basis for future expansion. In 1231 to 1242, 40 such castles were built. The Prussians faced major difficulties in capturing these castles as they were accustomed only to battling in open fields. Most conflicts occurred either in summer or winter. Heavily armored knights could not travel and fight on land soaked by water from melting snow or autumn rains. Summer campaigns were most dangerous, as the knights would immediately build new castles in the conquered territory. The Teutonic Knight strategy proved successful. In 10 years, 5 of the 7 major Prussian clans fell under control of the less numerous Teutonic Knights. However, the Prussians further resisted the conquerors, leading to 5 uprisings over the following 50 years. The First Prussian Uprising. The First Prussian Uprising was influenced by 3 major events. Firstly, the Teutonic Knights lost the Battle of the Ice on Lake Peipus to Alexander Nevsky in April 1242. Secondly, southern Poland was devastated by a Mongol invasion in 1241. Poland lost the Battle of Legnica and the Teutonic Knights lost one of its most trusted allies that often supplied troops. Thirdly, Duke Świętoполk II of Pomerania was fighting against the Knights, who supported his brother's dynastic claims against him. It has been implied that the new castles of the knights were competing with his lands over the trade routes along the Vistula River. While some historians embrace the Swantopolk-Prussian alliance without hesitation, others are more careful. They point out that the historical information came from documents written by the Teutonic Knights and must have been ideologically charged to persuade the Pope to declare a crusade not only against the pagan Prussians but also against the Christian Duke. Prussians besieged Teutonic castles and managed to capture all except for Elbing and Balga in the eastern regions of Netanya, Barta and Warmethorn, Kulm, and Redden in the western parts. In December 1242, the knights were able to capture Sartovica, Swantopolk's castle on the banks of the Vistula. The ensuing 5-week siege of Sartovica failed to recapture the fortress and Swantopolk lost 900 men. In the spring of 1243, Swantopolk also lost the castle at Nakel, which dominated trade on the Notek River. In the face of these losses, the Duke was forced to make short-lived truce. In the summer of 1243, Prussians with Sudovian help raided the Comaland and, on their way back, defeated the pursuing Teutonic Knights on June 15 on the banks of the Osa River. Some 400 Teutonic soldiers perished, including their marshal. Swantopolk, encouraged by the defeat, gathered an army of 2,000 men and unsuccessfully besieged Kulm. The Teutonic Knights managed to gather a coalition against Swantopolk. Dukes of Masovia were given territories in Prussia, Dukes of Greater Poland received Nakel, and Dukes of Pomerania, brothers of Swantopolk, hoped to regain their inheritance. Swantopolk built a castle at Zanta, where Nogat separated from the Vistula, and launched a blockade of Elbing and Balga. While the castle withstood Teutonic attacks, the blockade was smashed by Cogs. In late 1245, Swantopolk's army suffered a great defeat at Swetwice, and another one in early 1246, where 1,500 Pomeranians were killed. Swantopolk too asked for truce and Pope Innocent IV appointed his chaplain, Jacob of Liege, the future Pope Urban IV, to handle the peace negotiations. However, the war was renewed in 1247 when large Teutonic reinforcements arrived in Prussia. On Christmas Eve of 1247 the knights besieged and overwhelmed a major Pomezanian fortress, which they later renamed Christberg, and newly arrived Henry III, Margrave of Meissen subdued the Pomezanians. Swantopolk retaliated and destroyed Christberg, but the knights rebuilt it in a new location. Both Prussian and Swantopolk's armies failed to capture the new castle. Otto III of Brandenburg raided Warma and Netanya, forcing the locals to surrender. The peace talks that began in 1247 achieved little, but a new truce was arranged in September 1248 and peace was made on November 24, 1248. Swantopolk had to return land seized from his brothers, allow Teutonic Knights to pass through his domains, stop charging tolls on ships using the Vistula, and stop any aid to the Prussians. Prussians were compelled to sign the Treaty of Christberg on February 7, 1249. The treaty provided personal freedom and rights to newly converted Christians. It formally ended the uprising, but already in November 1249 the Netanyans defeated the Knights at the Battle of Kruken. The skirmishes lasted until 1253 and some sources cite this year as the end of the uprising. At that point the treaty ceased its political power but remained an interesting historical document. The Great Prussian Uprising. Preparation and tactics. The major revolt began on September 20, 1260. It was triggered by the Lithuanian and Samogitian military victory against the joint forces of the Livonian Order and Teutonic Knights in the Battle of Dub. As the uprising was spreading through Prussian lands, each clan chose a leader. The Sambians were led by Glander, the Netanyans by Hercusmonti, the Bartians by Dawanus, the Warmans by Glappa, the Podjazanians by Orktuma. One clan that did not join the uprising was the Pomezanians. The uprising was also supported by Scarmantis, leader of the Sudovians. However, there was no one leader to coordinate efforts of these different forces. Hercus Monti, who was educated in Germany, became the best known and most successful of the leaders, but he commanded only his Natangians. The Prussians besieged the many castles that the knights had built and could not send large armies to fight in the west. Prussians were not familiar with Western European siege tactics and machinery and relied on siege forts, built around the castle, to cut the supplies to the garrisons. The Teutonic Knights could not raise large armies to deliver supplies to the starving garrisons, and smaller castles began to fall. Those castles were usually destroyed and the Prussians manned just a few castles, notably one in Heilsberg, because they lacked technology to defend the captured castles and organization to provide food and supplies to stationed garrisons. On August 29, 1261, Jacob of Liege, who negotiated the Treaty of Christberg after the First Uprising, was elected as Pope Urban IV. He, having an inside scope on events in Prussia, was especially favorable to the Teutonic Knights and issued 22 papal bulls in 3 years of his papacy calling for reinforcements to the knights. However, the reinforcements were slow to come as Dukes of Poland and Germany were preoccupied with their own disputes and the Livonian Order was fighting the Semigalian uprising. Early Prussian success. The first reinforcement to the Teutonic forces arrived in early 1261, but was wiped out on January 21, 1261 by Hercus Monti in the Battle of Pokawisch. In January 1262 reinforcements arrived from the Rhineland, led by Wilhelm VII, Duke of Jülich, who was obliged by Pope Alexander IV to fulfill his crusader duties in Prussia. This army broke the siege of Königsberg, but as soon as the army returned home, the Sambians resumed the siege and were reinforced by Hercus Monti and his Natangians. Hercus was later injured and the Natangians retreated, leaving the Sambians unable to stop supplies reaching the castle, and the siege eventually failed. Prussians were more successful capturing castles deeper into the Prussian territory, and the knights were left only with strongholds in Balga, Elbing, Kulm, Thorn, and Königsberg. Most castles fell in 1262 to 1263, and Bartenstein fell in 1264. The Prussians destroyed captured forts instead of using them for their own defense. So the end of successful sieges meant that large Prussian forces did not have to stay near their home and were then free to operate in other parts of Prussia, raiding the Kulmerland and Kuyavia. A recovered Hercus Monti raided Kulmerland with a large force and took many prisoners in 1263. On his way back to Netanya, Hercus and his men were confronted by a contingent of their enemies. In the Battle of Lobau that ensued, Prussians killed 40 knights, including the master and the marshal. The Prussians also received help from Lithuanians and Sudovians. In summer of 1262, Treniota and Schwan attacked Masovia, killing Duke Siemautai, and raided Kulmerland, provoking Podjazanians to join the uprising. However, assassination of Mindaugas and subsequent dynastic fights prevented Lithuanians from further campaigns. Scarmantis, leader of Sudovians, raided Kulm in 1263 and in 1265. Turning point. The year of 1265 was the turning point in the uprising. More substantial reinforcements for the Teutonic Knights finally started arriving in Prussia, and Sambia gave up the fight. Teutonic castles in Königsberg and Wehlau on the Pregel River cut off the region from the rest of Prussia. Supplies to Königsberg were brought by sea, and the castle served as the basis for raids in surrounding Samland. The Livonian Order sent troops to Königsberg, and the joint forces defeated the Sambians in a decisive battle, forcing them to surrender. In 1265 reinforcements arrived from Germany. Armies of Duke Albrecht of Braunschweig and Margrave Albert of Meissen arrived in Prussia, but were unable to achieve much. In 1266 Otto III and John I, co-rulers of Brandenburg, built a castle in the Notangian lands between Balga and Königsberg and named it Brandenburg. Due to bad weather, they did not organize campaigns into Prussian lands. When the dukes returned home, Brandenburg was captured by Glapper and his Warmans. The very next year Otto returned to rebuild the castle. However, both John and Otto died before the end of 1267, and Otto's son was killed in a tournament. Subsequent dukes of Brandenburg were not as supportive of the knights. In 1266, Duke Swantopolk, the supporter of the Prussians during the First Uprising, died, and his sons Mestwin and Warsaslaw briefly joined the Prussians in the uprising. In 1267, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, who already participated in the Prussian Crusade in 1254 and who was promised by Pope Urban IV all Prussian lands he could conquer, finally arrived in Prussia. His only achievement was forcing Duke Mestwin to reconcile with the Teutonic Knights. His large army was unable to campaign due to an early thaw. Heavily armed knights could hardly fight during the wet and swampy spring season. The warfare with the Prussians relied on guerrilla raids in the border regions. Small groups of men, a dozen to 100, made quick raids on farms, villages, border posts, etc. This was a positional warfare where neither side could defeat the other, but the Teutonic Knights relied on future reinforcements from Germany and Europe, while Prussians were draining their local resources. After the massacre of surrendered Teutonic soldiers in the Battle of Krucken in 1249, the Knights refused to negotiate with the Prussians. The Prussians were also unable to coordinate their efforts and develop a common strategy. While each clan had its own leader, there was no one to lead all the clans. The Natangians had to watch for attacks from Balga, Brandenburg, Wellor, and Königsberg, while the Warmans were threatened by garrisons at Christberg and Elbing. This way only Dewan and his Bartians were able to continue the war in the west. They made several minor expeditions to Comaland each year. The end of the uprising, the major Prussian offensive, was organized in 1271 together with Linke, leader of the Poggezanians. The Bartian infantry and Poggezanians besieged a border castle, but were fended off by the knights from Christberg. The Prussians who managed to escape joined their cavalry while the knights set up a camp on the opposite bank of the Dargana River, blocking the route home. When Christians retired for the night, one half of the Prussian army crossed the river in a distance, in order to attack the knights from the rear, while the other half charged straight across the river. The knights were encircled. The Battle of Pagenstein saw 12 knights and 500 men killed. The Prussians immediately assaulted Christberg and almost captured it. The Prussians were still looting the surrounding area when cavalry from Elbing arrived. Many of the Prussian infantry perished while cavalry escaped. Despite these losses, Dewan was soon back and blocked roads leading to Christberg, hoping to starve the castle. Dewan was killed during a siege of a small post at Chauncey in 1273. In the winter of 1271 to 1272, reinforcements arrived from Meissen, led by Count Dietrich II. The army invaded Natangia and besieged an unnamed Natangian castle. While the assault claimed 150 lives of the Crusaders, most of Natangian resistance was broken and the region was decimated. Hercus Monti, with a small group of his followers, was forced to withdraw to the forests of southern Prussia. Within a year he was finally captured and hanged. The last Prussian leader, Glapper of Warmans, was also hanged when his siege campaign on Brandenburg was attacked from the rear. The last tribes standing were the Poggezanians, who made a surprise raid into Elbing and ambushed its garrison. In 1274 the knights made a great expedition to avenge this raid, capturing the rebel headquarters at Heilsberg and ending the uprising. The knights proceeded to rebuild and strengthen castles destroyed by the Prussians. A number of Prussians escaped either to Sudovia or to Lithuania, or were resettled by the knights. Many free peasants were made into serfs. Local nobles had to convert and give hostages, and only a few of them were granted privileges to retain their noble status. From 1274 to 1283 the Teutonic Knights conquered Scalvians, Nadruvians, and Sudovians, Jotvingians. Further uprisings and aftermath. After the Great Uprising, the Prussians rose a number of times against the Knights, but these uprisings were much smaller in scale and posed no real danger to the Teutonic Knights, who could concentrate on further conquests. The number of uprisings is variously considered to be 2 or 3. They were suppressed within a year or two, and showed exhaustion and division of the Prussian tribes. The third uprising in 1276 was provoked by Scalmantis, leader of the Sudovians, who successfully raided Teutonic lands. The next year he, with help from the Lithuanians, led 4,000 men into the Coma land. The uprising failed to spread after Theodoric, vote of Sambia, convinced the Sambians not to join the insurrection. Netanians and Warmans had also accepted baptism and promised their loyalty to the Knights. The Podgezanians alone continued the fight and were crushed. Survivors with their Bartian chief escaped to Rodna in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where they joined some of the Bartians, Scalvians, and all of the Nadruvians, who fled there after the Great Uprising. The last two Prussian attempts to rid itself of the Teutonic rule were made relying on the foreign powers who were enemies of the Knights. The first one in 1286, also known as the Fourth Uprising, depended upon help from the Duke of Rügen, the grandson of Swantopolk. The plot was soon revealed and the Bartians and Podgezanians suffered the consequences. In 1295 the last uprising was limited to Netanya and Sambia and depended upon help from Vytnich, Grand Duke of Lithuania. The rebels captured Bartenstein by surprise and plundered as far as Königsberg, but were never a serious threat. By that time Prussian nobility was already baptized and pro-Teutonic to the extent that peasants killed them first before attacking the Knights. This last attempt effectively ended the Prussian Crusade, and the Knights concentrated on conquering Samogitia and Lithuania. Lithuanian historians note that fierce resistance by the Prussians won time for the young Lithuanian state to mature and strengthen so it could withstand the 100-year crusade, culminating in the 1410 Battle of Grunwald with minimal territorial losses. The Prussian lands were repopulated by colonists from Germany, who after the 16th century eventually outnumbered the natives. It is estimated that around 1,400 Prussians numbered 100,000 and comprised about half of the total population in Prussia. The Prussians were subject to Germanization and assimilation and eventually became extinct sometime after the 16th century. It is believed that the Prussian language became extinct sometime at the beginning of the 18th century.